treated like a press conference. Candles perfectly aligned, wine glasses polished, my father in his pressed button down, posture straight like he was about to deliver quarterly earnings. My younger sister, Chloe, sitting beside him, glowing in confidence because she had just landed a big corporate job. They were celebrating her promotion, or so they thought. "We just want tonight to go smoothly," my mother said before dessert was served. Her voice had that warning sweetness. "Please don't bring up anything that might embarrass us." I looked up from my plate slowly. "Embarrass you how?" My father cleared his throat. "We heard you've been making business moves." That pause was intentional. They didn't know details. They only knew whispers. I had spent the last 8 years building something quietly. Not flashy, not loud, just disciplined. A logistics technology firm that started in my apartment with one client and a borrowed laptop. Now we had 143 employees and contracts in 4 states. But I hadn't announced it at family dinners. I hadn't posted articles or sent newsletters. I learned long ago that in this house, visibility was a liability. "Chloe works for a very prestigious firm now," my mother continued. "Let's keep the focus there." Chloe smiled politely. She had always been the polished one. Marketing degree, corporate office, branded tote bags, and LinkedIn posts. She thought I ran a consulting side hustle. I let that belief exist. It was easier. "I don't plan on stealing her spotlight," I said calmly. My father leaned forward. "Good, because corporate reputation matters." The irony almost made me laugh. Corporate reputation, that was rich. My phone buzzed in my pocket at that exact moment. I didn't check it. I already knew what it would say. The board had just finalised the acquisition paperwork. The acquisition of the company Chloe proudly believed she worked for. The one she introduced at dinner like it was her stepping stone to power. I had signed the deal 45 minutes earlier, and neither of my parents knew that their corporate success story now technically answered to me. I smiled softly and took a sip of water. "Trust me," I said. "I won't ruin the image." They didn't realise I was about to redefine it. Dinner continued as if nothing had shifted, but I could feel the timeline ticking in my pocket. Chloe was mid-story about her new regional strategy team, explaining how her company was restructuring operations for aggressive expansion. I recognised the phrasing immediately. It came straight from the acquisition deck my firm had written. My father nodded along proudly. "That's the kind of leadership that builds real success," he said. I watched Chloe carefully. She wasn't arrogant. She was unaware. She genuinely believed she had climbed somewhere impressive on her own. And she had worked hard. I'd never denied that. What she didn't know was that her firm had been bleeding for 2 years. Poor infrastructure, inflated overhead. Leadership too focused on branding instead of logistics. When my company approached them for acquisition, they accepted because they didn't have leverage. And tonight, my family was praising a ladder that had already been folded up. "So what exactly do you do these days?" my mother asked suddenly, eyes narrowing slightly. The room quieted. Chloe glanced at me with polite curiosity. I set my fork down. "I run operations." My father smiled thinly. "Operations of what?" There it was, the test. I pulled my phone from my pocket slowly, not dramatically, just enough to check the notification I had been waiting for. The subject line read, "Acquisition confirmed. Integration begins Monday." I locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the table. "Infrastructure and logistics," I replied calmly. "Mostly scaling mid-sized companies that can't handle growth." My father chuckled lightly. "Well, that's modest." Chloe leaned forward. "Actually, that's exactly what my company is doing." I met her eyes. "Yes, I know." She smiled, thinking it was coincidence. "Maybe you've read about us." "I have," I said evenly. "Extensively." My mother crossed her arms. "Just remember, Natalie, humility is important." Humility. I almost admired the timing. My phone buzzed again. This time Chloe's phone buzzed too. She glanced at the screen casually at first. Then her expression silently for a moment longer. Then she looked up at me. "Do you know someone named Natalie Ray?" The room shifted. I held her gaze. "Yes," she swallowed. "It says she's the new majority owner." Silence pressed down so hard, I could hear my mother's breath catch. My father's face drained of colour slowly, like realisation was pulling it away inch by inch. Chloe blinked. "Wait," she looked back at her screen. "It says, Integration under Row Logistics Group." I folded my hands neatly on the table. That would be mine. And just like that, the family image cracked. No one spoke for several seconds. It wasn't shock in the dramatic sense. It was recalculation. My father's expression moved from disbelief to suspicion, as if he was trying to locate the flaw in a story he hadn't anticipated. My mother looked between Chloe and me like she was waiting for someone to laugh and say it was a misunderstanding. Chloe stared at her phone again, rereading the email as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less destabilizing. "This isn't funny," my father said finally, voice low. I didn't smile. "I'm not joking." Chloe's voice came out thinner than usual. You bought my company." I tilted my head slightly. "Technically, I acquired controlling interest in the parent corporation." The room felt smaller now, the chandelier above us suddenly too bright. My mother's lips parted. "Why would you do that?" The question wasn't financial. It was territorial. "Because they were mismanaged," I replied calmly, "and because they needed structural stability." My father leaned back in his chair. "And you didn't think to mention this?" I met his gaze evenly. "You asked me not to embarrass the family image." That landed harder than anything else I'd said. Chloe stood up abruptly. "Does this mean I report to you?" It was the first question grounded in reality. "Not directly," I said. "There will be a transition team." Her shoulders tightened. "You should have told me." I held her eyes. "When?" She didn't answer, because she knew. I had spent years keeping my business separate from family dinners, not out of secrecy, but out of preservation. Every time I hinted at expansion, my mother dismissed it as freelance. Every time I mentioned investors, my father asked if it was stable. So I stopped offering details. "You let us think you were just consulting," my mother said quietly. "You let us think that," I corrected. Silence was different. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about hierarchy. For years, Chloe had been the corporate success story. I had been the practical one with a side business. Now, the narrative had inverted, and they didn't know where to place me. My father finally spoke. "This is going to change things." "Yes," I agreed. "It will." Chloe sat back down slowly. "Does this mean layoffs?" That question carried weight. It wasn't ego. It was fear. "No," I said immediately. "It means restructuring inefficiency. It means fixing what leadership ignored." I looked directly at her. "Your role is safe." She exhaled softly, tension easing just a fraction. My mother studied me carefully now. "You've been planning this for 2 years. rubbed his temple like he was trying to massage away the reality. You realise people will connect the last names. Eventually, I said. Yes, my mother's voice tightened. And what will they think? There it was. Not concern about Chloe's job. Not curiosity about strategy, optics. They'll think a logistics firm acquired a struggling operation, I answered. That's how business works. She flinched at the word struggling. Chloe looked up at me carefully. Was it really struggling? I didn't sugarcoat it. Yes. Her jaw tightened. Why didn't leadership fix it? I hesitated briefly, because they were focused on growth without foundation. My father let out a short, humourless breath. You sound like a consultant. I am one, I replied. The tension shifted slightly. Not gone, but redirected. Chloe leaned back in her chair. So what happens now? Monday, I said. Integration begins. Departments get audited. Redundant contracts reviewed. Workflow optimised. My mother stared at me. You're talking about her job like it's a spreadsheet. I held her gaze. It is. Silence. Chloe studied me for a long moment, then said something that surprised everyone. I want to be part of the transition team. The words landed sharply. My father blinked. My mother frowned. You don't have to prove anything, she said quickly. Chloe shook her head slightly. I'm not proving anything. I just want to understand what's actually happening. That was the first truly professional sentence she had spoken that evening. I nodded slowly. Send me your updated portfolio, I said. We'll review it. The dynamic had shifted entirely now. Not because I had humiliated them, but because authority had quietly changed hands. My father finally returned to the table. Just make sure, he said carefully, that this doesn't damage the family reputation. I looked at him steadily. The only thing that damages reputation is pretending. And this time, no one argued. The house felt different after that dinner. Not quieter, sharper. My mother cleared plates with careful movements, as if the dishes might break under the weight of what had just happened. My father remained standing near the table, staring at the folder I'd placed there earlier in the evening. Acquisition, documents, integration timelines, financial forecasts. For years, he had been the one explaining business to the rest of us. Now he was studying my paperwork like it was written in a language he had underestimated. Chloe stayed seated, her phone face down on the table. So, this is real, she said softly. It wasn't a question. Yes, I replied. She nodded slowly, processing. You've been negotiating this for 2 years. 18 months formally, I corrected. Longer strategically. My mother crossed her arms, but her posture wasn't defensive anymore. It was unsettled. Why didn't you tell us? She asked. You told me not to embarrass you, I reminded her calmly. That line didn't sound sharp anymore. It sounded factual. My father exhaled through his nose. You let us underestimate you. You were comfortable underestimating me, I replied evenly. Silence followed, the kind that forces self-reflection rather than argument. Chloe finally stood and walked toward the counter, pouring herself water. Does everyone at work know you're my sister? She asked without turning around. Only HR, I said, and they signed confidentiality agreements. She let out a short breath. So, I still have to prove myself. I met her eyes across the room. You always did. That wasn't cruel. It was professional. My father leaned back into his chair. This is going to shift perception, he muttered. Yes, I said. It will. My mother's voice softened slightly. You didn't do this to make a point, did you? I held her gaze. I did it because it was a sound investment. She studied me, searching for arrogance. There wasn't any, just steadiness. And if the company fails, she pressed. It won't, I replied calmly, because I don't build on image. I build on infrastructure. That was the difference. My family had always valued appearance first. I valued systems. Chloe returned to the table, shoulders straighter than before. What happens Monday? She asked. Audit, I said. Review reallocation. She nodded slowly. Then I'll be ready. That sentence shifted the energy entirely. For the first time that evening, this wasn't about embarrassment or hierarchy. It was about capability. My father finally closed the folder and pushed it back towards me. You've clearly outgrown the role we assigned you, he said quietly. I stood up. I didn't outgrow it, I replied. I stopped accepting it. And with that, the dinner ended not in conflict, but in recalibration. Monday morning arrived without drama, but the tension was unmistakable. The official press release went live at 8 a.m. sharp. Row Logistics. Group had acquired Montgomery Strategic Solutions in a majority stake. Deal aimed at stabilising operations and expanding regional capacity. Clean language, controlled tone, no mention of family ties. But anyone who looked closely would see the last names. Within hours, industry blogs began sharing it. By noon, LinkedIn was flooded with congratulatory comments. Chloe texted me once before her first internal meeting. This is weird, I responded simply. It doesn't have to be. Inside the Montgomery office, things were already shifting. Department heads were called into small conference rooms. Financial officers requested updated projections. HR began outlining new reporting lines. It wasn't chaos. It was order replacing drift. I watched from the oversight dashboard in my own office, reviewing reports as they came in. This wasn't personal. It was structural. But personal lines were impossible to ignore. My father called mid-afternoon. Your mother's worried. About what? I asked. That people will assume Chloe got her job because of you. I leaned back in my chair. Chloe had her job before the acquisition. Yes, but now she has to perform, I said calmly. Silence followed. That was the part they were uncomfortable with. Performance measured objectively, not assumed. Chloe called later that evening. Her voice was steadier than I expected. They announced the integration team, and they assigned me to it. I allowed a small smile. Good, she paused. Was that you? Yes. She exhaled slowly. Why? Because you asked to be involved. Another pause. You're not trying to push me out. I almost laughed softly. If I wanted to push you out, you wouldn't be on the team. Silence settled on the line, but it wasn't hostile. It was reflective. They're auditing marketing budgets first, she said. They found inefficiencies. I know. She hesitated. Some of those were my department. There. It was. The first crack of vulnerability. Then fix them, I replied evenly. She was quiet for a long moment. I thought you were going to punish me. For what? I asked. For not defending you at dinner. The honesty surprised me. This isn't revenge, I said calmly. It's business. She absorbed that. You're different at work, she said. No, I corrected gently. I'm consistent. That night, my mother called again. This feels intimidating, she admitted. I didn't rush to reassure her. It's supposed to feel organised, I replied. You don't have to like it. You just have to understand it. The family image she had protected so fiercely was evolving. Not collapsing, not shattering, just adapting to reality. And reality didn't need to be managed. It needed to be acknowledged. The shift wasn't loud. It was disciplined. And discipline changes rooms more permanently than embarrassment ever could. Monday began without ceremony. No dramatic entrances. No announcements beyond the official memo that had already circulated. Inside Montgomery Strategic Solutions, the atmosphere shifted from comfortable complacency to focused uncertainty. Employees gathered in small clusters near glass conference rooms, whispering about restructuring, about new ownership, about what it meant for their departments. Chloe texted me at 7:42 a.m. They're nervous, I replied. They should be focused. That wasn't cold. It was accurate. Nervousness comes from uncertainty. Focus comes from clarity. By 9, the integration meeting was underway. I watched through the live dashboard feed from my own headquarters office. The adults sat around a polished oval table, papers stacked neatly in front of them. Chloe was seated 3 chairs from the end, posture upright, expression composed. She didn't look intimidated. She looked alert. That mattered. The senior operations manager began presenting revenue breakdowns. Within minutes, the inefficiencies surfaced. Duplicate vendor contracts, inflated advertising spend, underperforming regional allocations. It wasn't sabotage. It was drift. Drift happens when leadership prioritizes visibility over structure. Chloe's department came up next. Marketing projections, brand partnerships, digital ad returns. I watched her carefully. When the CFO pointed out a misaligned campaign allocation, Chloe didn't deflect. She didn't blame subordinates. She leaned forward and said, "We overestimated conversion metrics. That's on my team." The room quieted. Accountability always does that. I felt a subtle shift of respect, even through a screen. After the meeting ended, my phone rang. It was my father. "She handled that well," he said. His tone was different, less protective, more analytical. "She did," I agreed. "You didn't interfere?" "No," he paused. "You could have." I leaned back in my chair. "If she's going to work under my leadership structure, she earns it on her own." Silence. Then, almost reluctantly, "That's fair." Later that afternoon, Chloe called. Her voice carried adrenaline, but not fear. "It's intense," she admitted, "but it's organised." "Good," I said. "They're looking at everything." "They should." She exhaled slowly. "I thought you were going to treat me differently." "Why would I?" I asked. "Because we're sisters." I answered without hesitation. "That's exactly why I won't." There was a pause on the line. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "I respect that." The word felt heavier than praise. Respect meant recalibration. It meant she no longer saw me as the quiet one at the table. She saw me as the authority in the room. That night, my mother called again. "How was it?" she asked carefully. "Productive," I replied. "Chloe performed well." My mother exhaled audibly. "You're not punishing her?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm leading her." That distinction mattered more than anyone in my family had anticipated. Leadership doesn't humiliate, it clarifies. And clarity was the one thing our family had avoided for years. By the end of the week, the numbers told a story no one could argue with. Operating expenses were trimmed by 12% without layoffs. Vendor contracts renegotiated. Logistics delays reduced. The internal Slack channels that had buzzed with anxiety on Monday were noticeably calmer by Friday afternoon. Chloe sent me a short message before leaving the office. "We're actually running smoother." I allowed myself a small smile. Stability doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles quietly into place. That evening, my parents invited me over again. The tone of the invitation was different this time. Not cautious, not tense, curious. When I arrived, my father was already reviewing the public market reaction to the acquisition. "Stock analysts are optimistic," he said, tapping his tablet. "They think the restructuring was overdue." My mother looked up from the stove. "People are saying your leadership style is disciplined." She sounded almost amused by the word. "It is," I replied evenly. Chloe arrived a few minutes later, carrying a stack of printed reports. "I figured you'd want these," she said, handing them to me. I flipped through the pages quickly. Clean numbers, clear projections, no fluff. "This is solid," I said. She nodded once, absorbing that approval without defensiveness. Dinner that night felt entirely different from the engagement dinner weeks earlier. No warnings, no subtle attempts to manage perception. Instead, my father asked direct questions about long-term strategy. "How do you prevent drift from happening again?" he asked. "Accountability structures," I replied. "Transparent reporting, defined authority lines." My mother listened carefully. "We never had that at home," she said quietly. I looked at her. "No, we didn't." Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. Chloe leaned back in her chair, of our tension was about image, she admitted. I thought that was just how families operated. It's how insecure systems operate. I corrected gently. Families don't need performance. They need clarity. That landed softly, but no one rejected it. My father set his fork down. You didn't embarrass us, he said finally. The sentence felt like a closing loop. We embarrassed ourselves by not seeing you. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the weight of those words settle, not as vindication, as alignment, because what changed wasn't the acquisition. It wasn't the Colonel's speech. It was the willingness to look directly at what had always been true. I wasn't the quiet one. I wasn't the practical one. I wasn't the background support. I had simply been operating at full capacity in rooms that preferred smaller versions of me. And now those rooms had adjusted, not because I demanded it loudly, but because I stopped shrinking. And once that happened, the family image they were so desperate to protect didn't collapse. It evolved. The following month, the changes inside the company became measurable rather than theoretical. Revenue stabilized. Client retention improved. Internal communication became sharper. What surprised me most wasn't the success of the integration. It was how naturally Chloe adapted to it. She stopped leading with presentation slides and started leading with numbers. She asked harder questions. She challenged assumptions. She began showing up early to meetings instead of rehearsing confidence in front of the mirror. One afternoon, she called me after a particularly tense review session. You were right, she admitted. About what? About foundation. I waited. We were focused on optics, she continued. Campaign visuals, press mentions, awards. We weren't checking whether the back end could sustain it. I didn't say, I told you so. I didn't need to. That's not a character flaw, I said calmly. It's a structural one. She was quiet for a moment. I think we all confuse visibility with value. That statement felt bigger than business. It felt personal. I thought back to that engagement dinner, to the moment my mother had warned me not to embarrass them. It had never been about behaviour. It had been about control of perception. Later that evening, my father stopped by my office unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway for a second before stepping inside. You've changed the way this family thinks about leadership, he said. I looked up from my laptop. I didn't try to. That's the point, he replied. He walked further into the room, studying the charts pinned to the wall. For years, I thought strength meant not needing recognition, he continued. I told myself you were fine because you never complained. I met his gaze. Silence isn't proof of comfort. He nodded slowly. I see that now. That acknowledgement felt steadier than applause. Over the next few weeks, subtle shifts continued. My mother stopped introducing me as the serious one. Instead, she began saying, Elise runs a logistics firm. Not flashy, just accurate. At family gatherings, conversations no longer pivoted away from my work. They included it. Daniel asked for advice on operational efficiency in his own department. Chloe forwarded proposals for feedback without bracing for criticism. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was deliberate. One Sunday afternoon, we were all sitting on the back patio when my mother said something that would have been unthinkable months earlier. I was afraid you'd outgrow us, she admitted. I looked at her carefully. I didn't outgrow you, I said. I just stopped compressing myself. She nodded faintly, absorbing that. The difference between outgrowing and expanding had never been clear to her. Now it was. As the sun dipped behind the fence line, I realised the most powerful part of this entire shift wasn't the acquisition or the public correction. Leadership doesn't humiliate. It was the internal recalibration. The family image hadn't shattered. It had stretched to accommodate reality. And reality didn't require me to shrink anymore. That was the real victory. By the end of the quarter, the integration was officially labelled a success. Industry publications credited Row Logistics Group for strategic, stabilisation and measured leadership under transition. Chloe's department reported its first genuinely cycle in 2 years. She sent me the final summary report with a short message attached. No fluff this time, I replied with a simple, good. The dynamic between us had matured into something that didn't require tension. She no longer looked at me as competition. I no longer felt the need to protect myself from dismissal. At home, the shift felt equally steady. My parents stopped speaking in warnings and started speaking in questions. My father began asking about expansion plans. My mother asked about travel schedules without attaching. Commentary about risk. It wasn't dramatic repentance. It was behaviour correction. One evening, as we sat around the dining table again, my mother laughed at something I said. Not politely, not tightly, but genuinely. It struck me how rare that used to be. For years, humour at family dinners had come at my expense. Now it didn't need to. Daniel leaned back in his chair and said, I think the weirdest part is realising you were always operating at this level. Smite looked at him calmly. You just weren't looking. He nodded. Not defensively, just thoughtfully. My father set down his glass. You didn't embarrass us, he said again, almost as if he needed to repeat it to solidify the truth. We embarrassed ourselves by not seeing clearly. That sentence no longer carried tension, it carried understanding. Later that night, as I drove home, I replayed everything in my head. The warning at the engagement dinner, the Colonel's public acknowledgement, the acquisition email, the recalibration that followed. What struck me most wasn't how fast things changed. It was how fragile the old structure had been. The family image had depended on selective visibility. It required me to stay small so others could feel stable. Once that dynamic shifted, nothing actually collapsed. It reorganized. Strength didn't disrupt the system. It refined it. The next morning, I received a message from Chloe. Thank you for not using this to humiliate us. I stared at the words for a moment before replying. Leadership isn't humiliation. That was the lesson none of us had. Understood before, visibility doesn't equal arrogance. Authority doesn't equal rebellion. Growth doesn't equal betrayal. Sometimes it simply means the room has finally adjusted its focus. And when it does, nothing dramatic happens. Just clarity. The final shift didn't arrive with a headline or a speech. It came quietly one afternoon when my mother called to tell me she had introduced me differently at a charity luncheon. I told them my daughter runs a logistics firm, she said. Not does something in support, not works in administration, just the truth. I thanked her, and for the first time it didn't feel overdue. It felt natural. Weeks later, at another family gathering, Daniel raised a toast, not for show, not as damage control, but with steady conviction. To clarity, he said, and to learning how to see each other without shrinking. His eyes met mine, not challengingly, not defensively, just evenly. That was new. My father stood beside him and added quietly, and to growth. My mother didn't interrupt. She didn't correct. She simply nodded. The moment Once they did, everything changed. Not because I demanded it loudly, but because I refused to shrink anymore. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Months later, the engagement dinner felt like a distant turning point rather than a defining wound. The acquisition was complete. The integration stabilized, and the company had moved forward under a structure built on clarity rather than image. Chloe had grown into her role with discipline instead of polish. My father asked sharper questions at family dinners, not about perception, but about sustainability. My mother no longer warned me about embarrassing anyone. Instead, she asked how upcoming contracts were progressing. The shift wasn't dramatic, it was consistent. One evening, we gathered again at my parents' house for a quiet dinner. No announcements, no external guests. Just the four of us around the same table where everything had once felt unbalanced. My father raised his glass and said something simple. To seeing clearly, my mother added, and to saying what's true the first time. Daniel nodded. Chloe smiled softly. I didn't feel the need to respond with a speech. I just lifted my glass and met their eyes evenly. After dinner, as we stood in the kitchen, my mother said something that closed the circle. I was afraid that if you stood out too much, it would shift the family dynamic. I considered that carefully. It did, I replied. She nodded, but not the way I expected. She had assumed visibility would fracture us. Instead, it forced us to rebalance. Later, outside on the porch, my father stood beside me in the quiet evening air. You didn't embarrass us, he said one last time. You showed us what we weren't seeing. I looked out over the yard. That's all I ever wanted. He exhaled slowly. You never needed protecting. No, I said calmly. I needed accuracy. That word had become the anchor of everything. Accuracy in how I was introduced. Accuracy in how I was understood. Accuracy in how I was valued. The night ended without tension, without unresolved edges. As I drove home, I reflected on the girl who once accepted being minimized to keep the peace. She had believed that shrinking herself made relationships stable. She had confused silence with maturity, but growth had shown her something different. Peace built on distortion isn't peace. It's postponement, and when the truth finally steps into the room, calm, disciplined, unshaken, it doesn't destroy the image. It replaces it with something stronger. My mother once said, don't embarrass us. The girl